So these early acoustic processing abilities set our brain up for how we're going to organize the incoming world. Our brains really are experience-dependent learning machines, if you want to call it that. We need our environment to stimulate the anatomical and physiological properties of the brains that we were born with. Without the environmental input, there's very little that's going to happen for us as humans, and even as animals. So it's an interaction between, clearly a very significant interaction between nature and nurture. We need our own physical environment to stimulate our brains. And for language users, in order to break the code for language, which ultimately is a phonemic code, at least for the English language, it's very much a phonemic code for our written language as well. We need to be able to organize the sounds that we hear very quickly in time, because the acoustic changes that tell us which speech sound we've just heard are frequency and amplitude changes that occur quickly in time. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with knowing a lot about the underpinnings of how the brain begins to process the sensory world, turn that into the phonological representations, and turn those into syllables, words, phrases, and ultimately allow us to develop a written code, which is the orthographic or letters that go with those sounds. And that we know that when you have trouble anywhere along that route, you're going to have difficulty with either oral language and or written language. Now, a lot of people out there may be saying right now, well, you know, I have a child who struggled a lot learning how to read, but they learn to talk perfectly well. They don't always go together, and that's true. There are many, many children who have difficulty learning to read who didn't have an overt oral language problem. And what I mean by that as overt is that there are lots of other routes to the same end. You can learn to talk relatively well without becoming that phonologically aware, without really needing to break the sounds down in your mind. It's only when you hit reading that you must become aware that words are made up of smaller units. But it doesn't mean that there really weren't subtle language problems. And in fact, one of the most remarkable scientific studies that has been published, in my opinion, recently, was an epidemiological study funded by the National Institutes of Health that showed that if you just screened children who are entering public school, 5-year-olds who are entering public school way before you'd worry about their reading or anything like that, if you just screen their oral language abilities, that almost 8% of them were so delayed in oral language development that they would frankly have been given a clinical diagnosis of having a language impairment if anyone had ever tested them. But in fact, very few of these children are tested because we allow a lot of individual differences in language development. In fact, when a child mispronounces words, it's very common up to a certain age, and everyone thinks it's kind of cute. The child that says biscotti, when they meant spaghetti, or wabbit when they mean rabbit. Those are all normal, healthy developmental trends up to a certain point in time. But we allow a lot of individual differences, and we don't really know on the whole very well when is it too late to be still saying biscotti or wabbit, and when is it too late to be saying, to not have your nouns and verbs go together and things like that properly. So we don't know very much as a society about what the language milestones really are. So what was interesting about this study was that although almost 8% of the children would have met the clinical diagnosis of specific language impairment, I think it was 79% of those children had never been identified by anyone, their parents, their teachers, their pediatricians, anyone, as being at risk for a language or a reading problem. They had the problem, but if you pointed out to a parent or something that the child really is delayed at language, you would get responses like, "Oh, I just thought he was shy," or "Well, no, he just really doesn't pay attention very well," or things along those lines. So I've always thought of oral language problems as being the hidden problem, the unrecognized problem, especially for the receptive language part, which is really hard to know. What is receptive language? It's the ability to understand what other people are saying. I mean, I'm talking right now and I'm having to assume, because people are shaking their heads and nodding, that they're understanding me. But in fact, I really don't know precisely what you do or don't understand. So it's a silent problem when a child's having a receptive language or a difficulty understanding, or one of these perceptual difficulties. If a child's having difficulty really hearing the subtle differences between, you know, bad and dad, well, over time they learn the context, you know. There are some confusing sentences like, you know, that was bad, that was dad. You know, it could have been either way. But most of the time our context really constrains what we're hearing. So you can get away with an awful lot without anyone noticing until you come to either try to read or spell, at which point the game is up. You either got it exactly or you didn't. Of course, you can read in context and you can guess words as well. But if you're really being asked to decode for real, then you must make that one-on-one correspondence. You must break the word apart and then put letters. So one of the most telling tests that's used now for determining a child's readiness to learn to read, or whether or not a child is actually having a reading problem, is the ability to pronounce non-words. Okay, what's a non-word? It's a series of sounds that could have been a word, but just doesn't happen to be. So let me think of a non-word. You take any word and just change a couple of letters. So let's take the word like rabbit. And I can just change the vowel from an A to an I, and it would have been ribbit. Could have been a word, just isn't a word. Okay, I could have changed the B's to double T, so it could have been writted. Could have been a word, isn't a word. Take a series of non-words and just ask a child to pronounce them. You know, so you give them a series of words starting with real simple ones and then ending up with multi-syllable ones. And that's one of the best tests of determining whether a child is going to have a reading problem or is having a reading problem, just the pronunciation of non-words. A better test still is ask them to read a series of non-words. Now, what's the value of that? If you give children a list of real words to read, many, many children who nonetheless have a significant reading problem can pass that test very well. Just like they can look like they didn't have an oral language problem. They can pronounce the individual words. They can memorize the word patterns from the visual display. But they haven't really cracked the code. They haven't really learned that each of the letters has a sound that goes with it, and that those sounds can change in different contexts. So that is one of the better signs of a reading problem, either pronunciation of non-words or the reading of non-words. And it also helps us to, again, once more understand that it is a continuum between the development of sound systems in the brain into the development of phonological representations, into the development of oral language, and all the way through written language and spelling.
One of the most interesting parts in all this is that it sounds to me like you're describing the infrastructure of processing that's happening underneath all of this, and that in different modalities, it's more timing critical. So in the case of reading, as an example, as our main theme here, in the case of reading, there has to be an assembly going on inside, and the timing it's taking to put this assembly together is critical to whether the whole thing flows. So in that sense, it's quite different than listening to somebody, even though underneath it, the same processes are involved.
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of people who've had, who might have difficulty with this hypothesis or theory would say, well, how does this really work for reading? Because after all, the word is on the page as long as you want to look at it. It's static.
Yeah.
And they don't really get that what we're talking about is what the brain has to go through. Not necessarily, now of course in the auditory input, that is fleeting. We really have trouble if you have a timing difficulty in the brain. If your brain is processing information more slowly, then you're really going to have trouble with ongoing language because it just doesn't wait for you.